In the summer of 1847, when the American frontier was still a deadly gamble between life and death, a young woman named Sarah McKenna lay bleeding in the scorching Nevada desert sand, clutching two newborn babies to her chest. Her husband was 3 days dead from cholera, her wagon train had abandoned her as a liability, and the nearest settlement was over 200 miles away. With no food, no water, and no hope, Sarah should have become another forgotten grave marker on the westward trail. Instead, her story became one of the most extraordinary tales of survival, unexpected friendship, and the bridge between two worlds that history almost lost forever. What happened next would challenge everything both cultures believed about enemies and allies, and prove that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. This is the true story of how a Lakota Sioux warrior named Running Bear defied his tribe's laws, risked his own life, and changed the course of two families forever. Some stories are too incredible to believe, yet too well documented to deny. This is one of them. Sarah McKenna had never imagined that her wedding dress would one day serve as bandages for bullet wounds, or that the gentle hands that once embroidered delicate flowers would learn to load a rifle in complete darkness. But the frontier had a way of transforming people, stripping away everything except the will to survive. The wagon train had started from Independence, Missouri, in early spring of 1847 with 43 families, all chasing the same dream that pulled thousands westward. Gold had been discovered in California, and every man, woman, and child believed they were just one journey away from a new life. Sarah and her husband Thomas McKenna had sold their small farm outside St. Louis, packed their entire lives into a covered wagon, and joined the mass migration that historians would later call one of the greatest human movements in American history. Thomas McKenna was a practical man, a blacksmith by trade, with strong hands and an optimistic spirit that never seemed to dim even when their wagon wheel broke for the third time in a week. Sarah, at 22, was pregnant with their first child and filled with excitement about starting fresh in the promised land of California. She had packed carefully, bringing her grandmother's china wrapped in quilts, her father's leather-bound Bible, and enough fabric to make clothes for their growing family. The wagon train was led by Captain James Morrison, a weathered man who had made the journey west 4 times before and knew every river crossing, every dangerous pass, and every friendly trading post along the 2,000-mile route. Morrison ran the train with military precision, establishing rules that everyone had to follow. No one traveled alone, guard duties rotated among the men, and when he said it was time to move, everyone moved. During the first weeks of travel, life on the trail developed its own rhythm. Sarah woke before dawn to help prepare breakfast over the campfire, walking alongside the wagon during the day to spare the oxen unnecessary weight, and falling asleep each night to the sounds of children playing and men discussing the next day's route. The women formed close friendships, sharing recipes, medical remedies, and stories about their hopes for the future. Thomas proved himself invaluable to the group, using his blacksmith skills to repair broken wagon parts, reset loose horseshoes, and fashion new tools when the old ones wore out. He was well liked by the other men and had a knack for settling disputes before they became serious problems. Sarah often watched him work, marveling at how he could take a piece of twisted metal and transform it into something useful and beautiful. The trail itself was both magnificent and terrifying. They crossed rivers that seemed impossible to ford, climbed mountain passes where one wrong step could send a wagon tumbling hundreds of feet, and traveled through valleys so beautiful that Sarah sometimes forgot to breathe. But the wilderness was also unforgiving. They passed graves marked with simple wooden crosses, evidence of families who had started the same journey but never finished it. As they moved deeper into the Western Territories, the landscape changed dramatically. The green farmland of Missouri gave way to rolling prairies, then to more arid regions where water became precious and every decision could mean the difference between life and death. The wagon train had to time their travel carefully, reaching water sources before their supplies ran out, and finding adequate grazing for the animals that pulled their entire lives across the continent. Sarah's pregnancy progressed during the journey, and she began to feel the baby moving inside her. The other women on the train, especially Mrs. Elizabeth Hartley, who had delivered 6 children of her own, helped Sarah prepare for what they all assumed would be a birth in California. They discussed baby names around the campfire, shared hand-me-down clothes, and promised to help with the delivery when the time came. But the trail had its own schedule, and it didn't accommodate human plans. When they reached the Platte River in Nebraska, disaster struck the McKenna family in a way that no one could have predicted. Thomas, who had been perfectly healthy the day before, woke up with a fever and severe stomach cramps. Within hours, he was vomiting violently and could barely stand. Dr. William Patterson, a physician traveling with his own family to establish a practice in Sacramento, examined Thomas and delivered the diagnosis that everyone feared: cholera. The disease had been following the wagon trains west all summer, killing travelers faster than bullets or Indian attacks. There was no cure, no treatment except rest and prayer, and it was highly contagious. Captain Morrison faced an impossible choice. If he quarantined the McKennas, he might save the rest of the group, but Thomas would likely die without proper care. If he allowed them to continue traveling with the train, the disease could spread and kill dozens of people. Morrison had seen entire wagon trains wiped out by cholera, leaving nothing but scattered bones and abandoned belongings to mark their passage. The decision was made during a tense meeting of the men while Sarah sat beside Thomas, watching his condition deteriorate by the hour. Morrison announced that the McKennas would have to separate from the group until Thomas either recovered or died. They would be given extra water and food supplies, but the train couldn't risk everyone's lives for one family. Sarah begged the other families to reconsider, explaining that she was months pregnant and couldn't care for Thomas alone in the wilderness. Mrs. Hartley and several other women argued passionately that abandoning a pregnant woman was morally wrong and went against everything they believed as Christians. But fear was stronger than compassion, and the decision stood. On a hot morning in July, the wagon train rolled away from their campsite, leaving the McKennas behind with their sick wagon, 2 exhausted oxen, and supplies for 1 week. Sarah watched the dust cloud disappear over the horizon, feeling more alone than she had ever felt in her life. Thomas was delirious with fever, calling out for his mother who had died years before, and Sarah was 7 months pregnant with twins, though she didn't know it yet. For 3 days, Sarah cared for Thomas under the blazing sun, trying to keep him cool and hydrated while managing their camp alone. She had never yoked oxen by herself, never built a fire without help, and never faced the terrifying sounds of wild animals prowling around their wagon at night. But she learned quickly, driven by desperation and love. On the 4th morning, Thomas seemed better. His fever had broken during the night, and he was able to sit up and drink some broth Sarah had made from their dwindling supplies. For a few hours, Sarah allowed herself to hope that they might survive, that they could catch up with the wagon train or find another group of travelers heading west. But cholera was unpredictable, and Thomas's recovery was temporary. That afternoon, the disease returned with devastating force. He died in Sarah's arms as the sun set on their 5th day alone, leaving her with no grave marker except a pile of stones and the terrible knowledge that she was completely alone in a land that showed no mercy to the weak or unprepared. Sarah spent that night sitting beside Thomas's grave, talking to him as if he could still hear her, making promises about raising their child and reaching California just as they had planned. But by morning, she faced a brutal reality. She was a pregnant woman alone in the wilderness, hundreds of miles from any settlement, with no idea how to survive. The morning after Thomas died, Sarah McKenna faced the most crucial decision of her life. She could stay by his grave and likely die within days, or she could attempt to continue west alone, knowing that her chances of survival were almost zero. As she sat in the early dawn light, watching the sun paint the endless prairie in shades of gold and amber, she felt the babies moving inside her and made her choice. Sarah spent the day preparing for a journey that seemed impossible. She couldn't manage the heavy wagon alone, so she took only what she could carry: a water barrel, dried meat and hardtack for several days, Thomas's rifle and ammunition, a knife, flint for making fire, her warmest blanket, and the small leather pouch containing their life savings of $43 in gold coins. Everything else, including her grandmother's china and the carefully chosen household items that represented their dreams, had to be left behind. Loading the supplies onto one of the oxen proved more difficult than she had imagined. The animal, confused by the change in routine and, sensing her fear, kept moving away just as she tried to secure the makeshift pack. It took her most of the morning to create a workable system, using rope and strips of canvas from the wagon cover to fashion a crude but functional carrying setup. Before leaving, Sarah carved Thomas's name and date of death into a piece of wood from their wagon wheel and placed it over his grave. She said a prayer, promised to tell their children about their father's goodness and courage, and turned her face west toward the mountains that stretched endlessly before her. Walking proved exhausting within the first few hours. The pregnancy had changed her body in ways that made the physical demands of frontier travel almost overwhelming. Her feet swelled in the heat, her back ached constantly, and she had to rest frequently. The ox, burdened with supplies and confused by the loss of its partner, moved slowly and required constant coaxing to keep going in the right direction. By the third day alone, Sarah realized she had made a terrible mistake in the route she had chosen. Following what she thought was the main trail, she had actually taken a path that led away from water sources and into increasingly barren territory. The landscape around her was becoming more desert-like, with sparse vegetation and no sign of the streams and rivers that were essential for survival. Her water supply, carefully rationed, was running dangerously low. The ox was suffering in the heat and showing signs of dehydration that Sarah recognized from her brief time on the wagon train. She knew that if she didn't find water within the next day, both she and the animal would die in the desert that seemed to stretch forever in all directions. On the fourth night, Sarah experienced her first real labor pains. They came without warning, sharp contractions that doubled her over and made it impossible to walk. She realized with growing terror that she was going into premature labor, alone in the wilderness, with no help available for hundreds of miles. The babies were coming whether she was ready or not. Sarah managed to create a makeshift shelter using her blanket and some dead branches from a scraggly tree. The contractions were getting stronger and more frequent, and she knew from watching other births that she had very little time to prepare. Using the knife, she cut strips from her petticoat to use as blankets for the babies, and she positioned the water container and other supplies within reach. The labor lasted through the night and into the next day, a grueling ordeal that tested every limit of Sarah's endurance. With no one to help her, she had to manage everything herself while dealing with pain that sometimes made her black out completely. She bit down on a piece of leather to keep from screaming, knowing that loud sounds could attract dangerous animals. When the first baby finally came, Sarah was amazed to discover she was having twins. The first child, a boy she immediately named Thomas after his father, was small but healthy, crying vigorously as she cleaned him with precious water and wrapped him in the cloth she had prepared. The second baby, another boy she decided to call David after her own father, arrived 2 hours later, smaller than his brother and worryingly quiet. Sarah managed to get both babies breathing and wrapped warmly, but she was bleeding heavily and growing weaker by the hour. She knew enough about childbirth to understand that she was in serious danger, but there was nothing she could do except rest and hope that her body would recover on its own. She was too weak to travel, almost out of water, and caring for 2 newborn babies with no shelter except a blanket stretched between some branches. For 2 days, Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes waking to find the babies crying and needing to be fed, sometimes so weak that she couldn't even lift her head. The ox had wandered away during the first night, taking with it most of their remaining supplies. Sarah was left with just the water in her small container, a few pieces of dried meat, and the terrible knowledge that she was going to die alone in the desert. On the third morning after giving birth, Sarah woke to find that she was too weak to stand. The babies were crying constantly, hungry and uncomfortable in the growing heat of the day. She had stopped bleeding, but her body was exhausted and dehydrated. The small amount of water she had been saving for the babies was nearly gone, and she hadn't been able to eat anything for over a day. Sarah spent what she thought would be her last morning writing a letter to her sister back in Missouri, using a piece of charcoal from their dead fire and a page torn from Thomas's Bible. She described what had happened to their family, asked her sister to pray for their souls, and included details about where she thought they might be so that someday their bodies could be found and given a proper burial. As the sun climbed higher and the heat became unbearable, Sarah lay down between her two sons and prepared to die. She had done everything possible to save them, but without water and food, they would all be dead within hours. She closed her eyes and began to pray, asking God to take care of Thomas in heaven and to forgive her for any mistakes she had made in caring for their children. That was when she heard the sound of horse hooves approaching from the distance. At first, Sarah thought she was hallucinating, but the sound grew stronger and more distinct. Someone was coming toward their makeshift camp, moving at a steady pace that suggested they knew exactly where they were going. Sarah tried to sit up to see who was approaching, but she was too weak to lift herself more than a few inches. Through the shimmering heat waves rising from the desert floor, she could make out the silhouette of a single rider on horseback, moving directly toward them with purpose and determination. As the rider came closer, Sarah could see that he was an Indian, sitting straight and tall on a painted horse, wearing traditional clothing and carrying weapons that marked him as a warrior. Her first instinct was fear, remembering all the stories she had heard about hostile tribes attacking travelers on the frontier. But she was too weak to run, too exhausted to fight, and she realized that her fate was now completely in the hands of this stranger. The rider stopped his horse about 20 feet from their camp and sat motionless for several minutes, studying the scene before him. Sarah could see his face clearly now, strong features weathered by years in the sun, dark eyes that seemed to take in every detail of their desperate situation. He was younger than she had expected, probably close to her own age, with long black hair decorated with feathers and beads. When he finally dismounted and walked toward them, Sarah closed her eyes and waited for whatever would happen next. She had no strength left to resist, no options except to hope that this warrior would show mercy to a dying woman and her babies. In her weakened state, she couldn't know that this meeting would change all their lives forever, or that the man approaching them had been tracking their movements for 2 days, trying to decide whether to help or simply let nature take its course. The warrior who approached Sarah's makeshift camp was called Running Bear by his people, the Lakota Sioux, and he was facing his own crisis that had nothing to do with the dying white woman and her babies lying in the desert. At 25 years old, he was considered one of the finest hunters and warriors in his band, but he had been banished from his tribe 3 weeks earlier for refusing to participate in a raid against a peaceful settlement of white farmers. Running Bear had been raised with traditional Lakota values that emphasized protecting the weak and honoring life, but he had also witnessed the devastating effects of the increasing conflicts between his people and the white settlers moving west. His own brother had been killed the previous year in a cavalry attack, and most of his tribe wanted revenge against any white person they encountered. Running Bear's refusal to join the war party had been seen as cowardice and betrayal, leading to his temporary exile. For the past 2 weeks, Running Bear had been living alone on the prairie, hunting and reflecting on his future while his tribal elders decided whether he would be permanently cast out or allowed to return. He had been tracking a small herd of antelope when he first noticed the smoke from Sarah's cooking fire, 3 days earlier. His initial instinct had been to avoid the white travelers completely, but something about the situation troubled him. When he investigated more closely, Running Bear realized he was looking at a tragedy in progress. He had watched from a distance as the woman buried what was obviously her husband, seen her struggle to prepare for a journey that she clearly couldn't complete, and observed her growing weakness as she tried to continue west alone. His warrior training told him to stay away, but his conscience wouldn't let him simply watch her die. The morning he finally approached their camp, Running Bear had spent hours debating with himself about what to do. Helping a white woman would be seen as the ultimate betrayal by his people, possibly earning him permanent exile or even death. But, letting her die when he could easily save her went against everything he had been taught about honor and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. When Running Bear knelt beside Sarah and saw the 2 newborn babies wrapped in her arms, his decision was made. Whatever the consequences, he couldn't let children die when he had the power to save them. In Lakota culture, children were considered sacred gifts, and their protection was every adult's responsibility, regardless of their race or family connections. Sarah was barely conscious when Running Bear first spoke to her, using the few English words he had learned from traders over the years. "Water," he said simply, showing her a leather pouch filled with clean, cool liquid. "Drink." Sarah was too weak to be afraid anymore, and she accepted the water gratefully, drinking slowly as he supported her head and helped her sit up enough to swallow safely. Running Bear quickly assessed their situation with the practical eye of someone who had spent his entire life surviving in harsh conditions. The woman was severely dehydrated and weak from childbirth, but she would recover with proper food and rest. The babies appeared healthy despite being born prematurely, but they needed their mother to be strong enough to feed and care for them. Most importantly, they needed to be moved to shelter and safety immediately. Using a combination of simple English words, hand gestures, and drawings in the sand, Running Bear explained to Sarah that he was going to help her. He showed her that he knew where to find water, indicated the direction of better shelter, and demonstrated that he understood she had babies who needed care. Sarah, still weak but beginning to hope for the first time in days, nodded her understanding and agreement. Running Bear's first priority was getting Sarah strong enough to travel. He rode to a water source about 2 miles away and returned with several containers filled with clean water. He also brought back edible plants and roots that he prepared into a nourishing soup, feeding Sarah small amounts every few hours to rebuild her strength without overwhelming her digestive system. Over the next 2 days, Running Bear set up a more permanent camp in a sheltered valley with access to fresh water and better protection from the elements. He constructed a proper shelter using branches, animal hides, and the fabric from Sarah's blanket, creating a space that was warm, dry, and large enough for Sarah and both babies. He also built a fire pit designed to burn efficiently while producing minimal smoke that might attract unwanted attention. During this time, Sarah began to recover physically, but she also started to understand the enormous risk that Running Bear was taking by helping her. Through their limited communication, she learned that he was not supposed to be helping white people, and that his own people might punish him severely if they discovered what he was doing. The knowledge that this stranger was risking everything to save her family filled Sarah with gratitude and a growing respect for the man who had become their guardian angel. Running Bear proved to be remarkably skilled at caring for newborn babies, something that surprised Sarah until she realized that Lakota men were expected to be active fathers and caregivers in their families. He showed her how to make soft, warm bedding from animal fur, taught her which plants could be used to treat common infant ailments, and even carved wooden toys that fascinated the babies as they grew stronger and more alert. As the days passed, Sarah and Running Bear developed a communication system that went far beyond words. They shared the daily tasks of caring for the camp and the babies, with Running Bear hunting and gathering food while Sarah focused on nursing and tending to Thomas and David. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and try to teach each other words from their respective languages, often laughing at their mutual struggles with pronunciation. Sarah learned that Running Bear had a wife and young daughter in his tribe, which made his sacrifice even more meaningful to her. He was not only risking his own future but potentially giving up the chance to return to his own family. When she tried to express her gratitude, Running Bear would simply point to the babies and smile, indicating that protecting children was not something that required thanks or special recognition. After 2 weeks in their hidden valley, Sarah was strong enough to travel, and Running Bear faced another difficult decision. Winter was approaching, and they needed to reach a settlement before the weather became impossible to travel through. But, taking Sarah and the babies to a white settlement would mean revealing himself to people who might see him as an enemy rather than a rescuer. Running Bear had been considering this problem for several days when the solution presented itself in an unexpected way. A small wagon train of late-season travelers passed through the area, moving slowly and carefully toward California. Running Bear observed them from a distance and determined that they seemed like decent people, traveling with families and showing no signs of the aggressive hostility that characterized some westward groups. The plan Running Bear developed was both simple and dangerous. He would approach the wagon train alone, without weapons, and try to explain Sarah's situation using his limited English. If they seemed trustworthy, he would lead them to Sarah and the babies. If they proved hostile, he would try to escape and find another solution. Either way, he was putting himself in enormous danger for people he had known for less than 3 weeks. On the morning that Running Bear rode out to contact the wagon train, Sarah watched him go with mixed emotions. She was grateful for the chance to rejoin civilization and continue her journey to California, but she was terrified about what might happen to the man who had saved her life. She had come to trust Running Bear completely, and the thought that he might be hurt or killed while trying to help her family was almost unbearable. Running Bear approached the wagon train during their midday rest, riding slowly with his hands clearly visible and calling out the few English phrases he knew. The initial reaction was exactly what he had expected: men grabbing rifles, women pulling children behind wagons, and everyone preparing for a fight. But the wagon train captain, a man named Samuel Richards who had dealt with various Indian tribes during previous trips west, recognized that Running Bear was trying to communicate rather than attack. Through a combination of English words, hand gestures, and drawings in the dirt, Running Bear managed to explain that he had found a white woman with babies who needed help reaching California. Captain Richards was skeptical at first, suspecting a trap, but something about Running Bear's earnest manner and obvious concern convinced him to listen to the full story. When Running Bear led a small group from the wagon train to Sarah's location, the reunion was emotional for everyone involved. Sarah wept with relief at seeing other white faces and hearing English spoken freely, while the travelers were amazed by the story of how a Lakota warrior had risked everything to save a stranger's life. Captain Richards, a practical man who understood the significance of what Running Bear had done, immediately began planning how to repay the debt they all owed to this unlikely hero. The wagon train that discovered Sarah and Running Bear was unlike any group of settlers that had traveled the Western Trail before. Led by Captain Samuel Richards, a former Army officer who had served in diplomatic roles with various Indian tribes, the group included several families who held progressive views about relations between white settlers and Native Americans. When they learned the full story of how Running Bear had saved Sarah and her twins, their response would challenge the typical assumptions about frontier interactions. Captain Richards immediately recognized that they were witnessing something extraordinary. In an era when most encounters between whites and Indians ended in violence or mistrust, here was a Lakota warrior who had risked everything to save a white woman and her children, asking for nothing in return except the knowledge that he had done what was right. Richards understood that this moment represented an opportunity to demonstrate that cooperation and mutual respect were possible between the two cultures. The wagon train's response to Running Bear was overwhelmingly positive, though not without some initial tension. While most of the travelers were grateful and impressed by his selfless actions, a few families remained suspicious and fearful, reflecting the general attitudes of the time. However, Captain Richards made it clear that Running Bear was to be treated as an honored guest, not as a potential threat, and that anyone who showed him disrespect would be asked to leave the group. Sarah found herself in the unique position of serving as an interpreter between two worlds. During the 3 weeks she had spent with Running Bear, she had learned enough Lakota words and gestures to facilitate basic communication, and she had gained insights into his culture that amazed the other travelers. She told them about his skills as a healer, his knowledge of plants and natural remedies, and his gentle way with children that contradicted every stereotype they held about Indian warriors. The integration of Running Bear into the wagon train's daily routine happened gradually but naturally. His hunting skills proved invaluable, as he could track and kill game that the other men couldn't even find. His knowledge of the terrain helped them avoid dangerous areas and find the best routes through difficult country. Most importantly, his presence seemed to provide a kind of protection, as other Indian groups they encountered recognized him as a person of honor and treated the wagon train with respect rather than hostility. For Running Bear, traveling with the wagon train was both fascinating and challenging. He observed the white settlers' way of life with the curiosity of an anthropologist, noting their different approaches to family relationships, decision-making, and daily survival. Some aspects impressed him, such as their mechanical innovations and their emphasis on written records and planning. Other practices puzzled or troubled him, particularly their treatment of the natural environment and their competitive rather than cooperative approach to resource sharing. The children in the wagon train were the first to completely accept Running Bear as a friend and teacher. They were fascinated by his stories, told through a combination of words and expressive gestures, about life on the plains and the animals that lived there. He taught them how to read weather signs, how to find water by watching bird behavior, and how to move quietly through the wilderness. In return, they taught him English words and showed him books, something he had never seen before but found immediately intriguing. Sarah's twins, Thomas and David, thrived during the journey with the wagon train, and Running Bear continued to be actively involved in their care. He carved wooden rattles and toys for them, showed Sarah how to make nutritious baby food from available plants, and often carried one or both babies while walking alongside the wagons. The other women in the group were initially surprised by his natural skill with children, but they quickly came to appreciate his help and expertise. As they traveled together, Sarah and Running Bear developed a friendship that transcended the cultural barriers between them. They shared stories about their respective backgrounds, with Sarah describing life in Missouri farming communities and Running Bear explaining the customs and beliefs of the Lakota people. These exchanges were educational for both of them, but they also revealed fundamental similarities in their values, particularly their devotion to family and their belief in helping others in need. The wagon train faced several crises during their journey where Running Bear's presence proved crucial to their survival. When they encountered a group of hostile Pawnee warriors who initially planned to attack the settlers, Running Bear was able to negotiate a peaceful passage by explaining the unusual circumstances of their group and vouching for the character of the people he was traveling with. His reputation as an honorable warrior carried weight with other tribes, even those who were normally enemies of the Lakota. During a severe thunderstorm that lasted 3 days, Running Bear's knowledge of shelter construction and weather prediction helped the entire group survive conditions that could have been devastating. He taught them how to reinforce their wagons against high winds, how to keep fires burning in heavy rain, and how to prevent their animals from panicking during lightning strikes. Several families later credited him with saving their lives during that storm. The most significant challenge came when they encountered a group of white soldiers who were part of a cavalry unit pursuing a band of Sioux warriors suspected of raiding settlements. The soldiers' initial reaction to seeing Running Bear traveling with the wagon train was hostile and suspicious, and they demanded that he be turned over to them for questioning about the recent raids. Captain Richards found himself in an extremely difficult position. Refusing to cooperate with the military could bring serious consequences for his entire group, but handing over Running Bear would be a betrayal of the man who had saved Sarah's life and helped their group survive numerous dangers. The confrontation lasted for hours, with tensions escalating to the point where violence seemed inevitable. Sarah played a crucial role in resolving the crisis by stepping forward to tell the soldiers her story. She described in detail how Running Bear had found her dying in the desert, saved her and her children, and then risked his own safety to get them to help. She explained that he was not part of any raiding party but was actually in exile from his own tribe specifically because he had refused to participate in attacks against white settlers. The wagon train's testimonies about Running Bear's character and actions gradually convinced the military commander that they were dealing with an exceptional situation. Several families spoke about how he had protected them from other hostile tribes, helped them survive dangerous weather, and demonstrated consistent loyalty to their group. The children, who had grown to love Running Bear like an uncle, were particularly effective witnesses to his gentle and protective nature. After extensive deliberation, the cavalry commander made the unprecedented decision to allow Running Bear to continue traveling with the wagon train, but with conditions. He would have to submit to periodic check-ins with military authorities, provide information about the movements of hostile tribes in the area, and agree to assist in peace negotiations when possible. It was an unusual arrangement that reflected the unique circumstances of their situation. The resolution of the military confrontation marked a turning point in Running Bear's relationship with the wagon train community. No longer was he just a helpful outsider who happened to be traveling with them, he had become a full member of their group, with rights and responsibilities that were recognized even by official authorities. This change in status was symbolized by Captain Richard's formal invitation for Running Bear to serve as the group's official scout and cultural liaison. As they approached the final stages of their journey to California, everyone in the group understood that their time together was coming to an end. Running Bear had accomplished his goal of getting Sarah and her children to safety, but he faced uncertain prospects for his own future. Returning to his tribe remained a possibility, but it would mean leaving behind the friendships he had formed and the new understanding he had gained about white culture. Sarah, meanwhile, was preparing to start a new life in California as a single mother with twin boys, but she was deeply concerned about what would happen to the man who had saved them all. She had been thinking about this problem for weeks, and she was beginning to formulate a plan that would allow her to repay Running Bear's kindness while also addressing his uncertain future. When the wagon train finally reached Sacramento in October 1847, the group that had started as strangers had become something resembling an extended family, with Running Bear as one of its most valued members. The city they found was booming with gold rush excitement, filled with people from all over the world who had come seeking fortune and a new start. In this environment of constant change and cultural mixing, Running Bear's presence attracted curiosity rather than hostility, and his reputation as the man who had saved Sarah McKenna and her twins preceded him through the community. Sarah faced the immediate challenge of establishing a life for herself and her children in a city where she knew no one and had limited resources. The $43 in gold coins that she had carried across the continent would not last long, and she needed to find work and housing quickly. However, the story of her survival and rescue had spread throughout Sacramento's small but tight-knit community, and she discovered that her reputation as the woman who had been saved by an Indian warrior opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed. Captain Richards proved to be instrumental in helping both Sarah and Running Bear transition to their new lives. He used his military connections to introduce Running Bear to officials who were interested in hiring him as a scout and interpreter for government expeditions into unmapped territories. His unique combination of wilderness skills, knowledge of multiple Indian languages, and demonstrated loyalty to white settlers made him valuable in a region where successful navigation of cultural relationships was essential for survival. Sarah found work as a seamstress and housekeeper for Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, the wealthy widow of a former Army officer who had been fascinated by Sarah's story and impressed by her character. Mrs. Whitman not only provided Sarah with employment but also offered her a small cottage on her property where she could live with Thomas and David. The arrangement gave Sarah the independence she needed while providing her children with a safe, stable environment. Running Bear's integration into Sacramento society was more complex but ultimately successful. He rented a small cabin on the outskirts of town, close enough to participate in the community but far enough away to maintain some privacy and continue practicing aspects of his traditional lifestyle. His work as a government scout provided him with steady income and respect from the authorities, but it also created opportunities for him to serve as a bridge between white settlers and local Indian tribes. The relationship between Sarah and Running Bear evolved during their first months in California as they both adapted to their new circumstances. They remained close friends who saw each other regularly, with Running Bear continuing to play an active role in raising Thomas and David. The boys, now healthy and growing rapidly, had formed a strong attachment to the man they called Bear, and Running Bear delighted in teaching them about tracking, woodcraft, and the stories of his people. As winter approached, Running Bear received unexpected news from his tribe. A delegation of Lakota elders traveled to California specifically to find him and discuss his possible return to the tribe. The delegation was led by his uncle, Chief Standing Cloud, who had initially supported Running Bear's exile but had spent months reconsidering the decision as reports of his nephew's actions reached the tribe through various channels. The meeting between Running Bear and his tribal delegation took place in Sacramento's main square, with Sarah, Captain Richards, and several other members of their wagon train present as witnesses. Chief Standing Cloud spoke at length about how Running Bear's actions had brought honor to their people, demonstrating that Lakota values of protecting the innocent and helping the helpless could be applied even to those who were traditionally considered enemies. The tribal elders offered Running Bear the choice of returning to his people with full honors or remaining in California with their blessing and support. They acknowledged that his experiences with white settlers had given him knowledge and perspectives that could benefit the tribe, but they also understood that he had formed new relationships and commitments that might be equally important to him. Running Bear's response surprised everyone present, including himself. Rather than choosing between his two worlds, he proposed creating a bridge between them. He suggested spending part of each year with his tribe, sharing what he had learned about white culture and serving as a liaison for peaceful negotiations, while also maintaining his home in California and continuing his work as a government scout and interpreter. Sarah played a crucial role in supporting Running Bear's innovative solution by offering to help educate tribal children in English and basic academic skills during his visits to the Lakota community. Her proposal was based on her recognition that the future would require both cultures to understand each other better, and that education could provide tools for peaceful coexistence rather than continued conflict. The arrangement that emerged from these negotiations was unprecedented in the history of white Indian relations in the American West. Running Bear would serve as an official cultural ambassador, spending 6 months each year with his tribe and 6 months in California, facilitating communication and understanding between the two communities. The U.S. government agreed to support this arrangement by providing funding and official recognition for his work. During the summer of 1848, Running Bear made his first return visit to his tribe, accompanied by Sarah and her twins. The journey was emotional for everyone involved, as Running Bear reunited with his wife and daughter after nearly a year of separation, while Sarah experienced Lakota culture firsthand and gained a deeper appreciation for the values and traditions that had shaped the man who saved her life. Thomas and David, now walking and beginning to talk, were fascinated by life in the Lakota camp and quickly formed friendships with tribal children. Their presence helped demonstrate to skeptical tribal members that white children were not fundamentally different from Indian children, and that friendship and cooperation between the races were possible when people approached each other with openness and respect. Sarah's work teaching English to Lakota children proved so successful that several other tribes requested similar programs. She developed teaching methods that respected Indian cultural values while providing practical skills that would help tribal members navigate an increasingly complex world where interaction with white society was becoming unavoidable. The success of Running Bear's dual life encouraged other individuals from both cultures to consider similar arrangements. Several white settlers learned Indian languages and customs, while some tribal members spent time in white communities, creating an informal network of cultural interpreters who helped prevent many potential conflicts from escalating into violence. As 1849 dawned, Sarah reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had brought her from the brink of death in the Nevada desert to a new life of purpose and meaning in California. Her twins were healthy and happy, growing up with an understanding of both white and Indian cultures that was almost unique among children of their generation. Her work teaching tribal children had given her a sense of mission that went far beyond simple survival. Running Bear had also found a way to honor both his traditional values and his new experiences, becoming one of the most trusted and respected cultural ambassadors in the American West. His success in bridging two worlds that seemed irreconcilably different demonstrated that individual courage and compassion could overcome even the deepest cultural divisions. The friendship between Sarah and Running Bear continued to be the foundation of their broader work promoting understanding between whites and Indians. They corresponded regularly when separated by their respective duties, collaborated on educational programs, and served as living examples of what was possible when people chose cooperation over conflict. Their story became legendary throughout California and beyond, inspiring books, newspaper articles, and even government policies aimed at promoting peaceful relations with Indian tribes. But, for Sarah and Running Bear themselves, the most important legacy was not their public recognition but the private knowledge that they had honored their deepest values by protecting life, promoting understanding, and choosing love over fear. Years later, as Thomas and David McKenna grew to adulthood, they would carry forward the lessons they had learned from their unusual upbringing. Both boys became advocates for Indian rights and cultural preservation, using the unique perspectives they had gained from their childhood to build bridges between communities that too often saw each other as enemies. The remarkable story that began with a dying woman and two newborn babies in the Nevada desert had evolved into a legacy of hope and possibility that would influence American frontier history for generations. It demonstrated that even in the harshest circumstances, individual acts of courage and compassion could change the world in ways that extended far beyond the original participants. Sarah McKenna and Running Bear had started as strangers from different worlds, brought together by desperate circumstances and mutual need. They became friends, partners in raising children, and colleagues in the work of building understanding between cultures. Most importantly, they proved that the human capacity for kindness and sacrifice could overcome any barrier that society or history might create between people who chose to see each other's fundamental humanity.